Welcome, everyone. So excited to be here. This is the first episode of our new live show, Do Your Own Research with The Defiant and IC3. So I'm moderating this panel. I am Camaruso, the founder of The Defiant. I'm here with Phil Daian, cryptoeconomic researcher who coined the term MEV, Justin Drake, researcher at the Ethereum Foundation, and Kushal Babel, PhD student at Cornell. All big brains to here to talk about MEV and how to improve it, what its implications are, and specifically the proposer builder separation. But first, just quick word on this show. Like I said, super excited about this collaboration between the Defiant and IC3. IC3 is a group of that conglomerates researchers from Cornell, Carnegie Mellon, ETH Zurich, UC Berkeley, and many other notable organizations and universities. Like I said, huge impactful names in this group. People from Flashbots, like we have here, from Chainlinks, Off-Chain Labs, and the list goes on. And the idea is to really go beneath the surface in crypto to provide you tools to understand more of what's happening in the space, and just to provide unbiased, objective information on some of crypto's biggest topics. So we start with MEV, minor. Sorry. So I'll let Phil, Diane, give the explanation of what MEV is, since he coined the term. And you coined the term in 2019 in the Flashboys 2.0 paper. But if you can give the brief explanation of what it is and also how the term has evolved since you wrote that paper.
Yeah, that's a great question. I was going to say it's evolved a lot and actually co-evolved with a lot of researchers in the Ethereum community. So the original term was minor extractable value, MEV, as it was defined, like you said, in Flashboys 2.0. And it basically referred to the amount of money that could be accrued to a special account in the system. In this case, you could think of it as like the miners or validators account, but it could be any account. By kind of censoring, reordering, or inserting your own transactions into kind of the action space that those parties have in the blockchain and protocol itself. So basically, if you were trying to be maximally profit-driven, how much can you increase your own accounts balance is the quantity known as MEV. It has various implications into how you design dApps, how you secure consensus protocols. It changes basically the incentives in the system. Over time, this term evolved more. So one obvious way is obviously we don't have miners in the Ethereum protocol anymore. And in the future, we may not even have validators as we know them today, or it may look very different than it is today. So to generalize the term, one thing we proposed is kind of iterating this definition to maximal extractable value. Of all the community proposals we made, it was the one that most people, I think, resonated with because they like calling it MEV. It's simple and this doesn't really need to change that. But it kind of generalizes the term a little bit more and kind of focuses on the fact that this account doesn't necessarily need to be a miner in the formula. Kushal here is a co-author on also a paper where we define that further and more rigorously. So maybe he wants to speak to that as well. But we kind of formalize the definition into this very rigorous notion of maximal extractable value, which was not super rigorous in the first kind of work. And I think I'll speak very quickly on it, but I think one misconception in the community is that having this formula is a prescription to, let's say, extract value, or it means that people are getting value extracted from them. The word extraction is kind of doing a lot of work here. In the definition, it is extractable value. So it is a value that is able to be extracted, not necessarily extracted. And there are various mechanisms that you can explore around redistributing this value, minimizing it, maximizing it, using it for security, there are all sorts of experiments that have happened and are still happening in the ETH space. So I see it more as a tool to kind of build systems and scientifically analyze your incentives.
Interesting. Yeah, Kushal, do you want to add to that and how your own research has contributed to the understanding of the term?
Yeah, I would resonate very much with Phil's thoughts there. So initially, when it was coined in the Flashbots 2.0 paper, it was an idea that this is happening, and there was empirical evidence that there is some strategic games being played on the blockchain. But then there was no kind of concrete mathematical definition of how we kind of study this phenomenon. And so in a follow-up paper that Phil mentioned, we defined what exactly is minor extractable value. How do we define it mathematically? And once you do that, it also gives you tools to kind of study it more rigorously, develop tools such as the one that we proposed in that paper. This was more of a formal verification based tools, but people have come up with all sorts of tools like heuristic based tools, machine learning based tools as well, which then kind of tell you how much value is extractable from the block that you are building. As Phil mentioned, I would like to echo that there's this misconception that only the value that is being extracted is the MEV. But I would say any value that is not extracted right now but is extractable, we should also think about that as well. And we should also carefully think about mechanisms that make it harder in some sense to extract value that is kind of detrimental to the ecosystem. And we can kind of divide up this extractable value into various components, one that can be used for the betterment of the protocol, one that can actually be minimized, which is detrimental to the users, and so on. I'm sure we'll talk about that more, but very much resonate with the thoughts that Phil put out there.
Great. And then, Justin, from the perspective of the Ethereum blockchain itself, how does MEV, either the extractable part or the extracted part, how does it impact the Ethereum blockchain and Ethereum end users?
Right. So in the context of Ethereum L1, we're trying to put in place incentives so that all the parties are incentive aligned. And one of the main tools that we have is issuance. So we can try and give issuance to proposers and attesters. And really what MEV is doing is distorting these incentives and potentially affecting the incentive alignment or causing centralization pressures or whatever it is. So one of the prime things that we've been trying to do from a research level is try and segregate MEV from the core of the consensus. And this is where proposer-builder separation comes in. But another thing that we've tried to do is harness it to improve the system. And maybe the best idea here is to take MEV and give it back to the ETH holders, so redistribute it in a maximally smooth and widespread way. And there's all sorts of ideas that we've had for that as well. One of the more recent ones is called execution auctions, but we've also had execution tickets and a previous design which was also literally called MEV Bern.
Okay, so a few really interesting concepts there. One is how MEV can impact the degree of centralization of the blockchain. Another one is how MEV impacts incentive alignment. And then this concept of actually using MEV to improve user experience or to give some value back to users, which is really interesting. If I can just like double click very briefly on some of those to understand. So how exactly does MEV impact centralization?
So one of the things that we realized early on, and actually this is an insight that Phil had, I think, in 2017, and I didn't really believe him, was that block building is going to become extremely sophisticated. Phil said there's going to be armies of PhDs that are going to be designing algorithms. And this is kind of what happened. You have big teams like Beaver Build that have maybe 40 or 50 people working full time, and they have very fancy computational resources. They have low latency infrastructure. They have fancy algorithms, and they have access to capital. and also they have connections for private order flow. And so if the consensus participants, namely the proposers, were to do all of this work to get the MEV, they would naturally have to become sophisticated themselves. And so the idea of PBS is to make sure that the proposers remain unsophisticated and the builders remain are sophisticated. And one of the beautiful things about PBS is that the proposers don't have to trust the builders. So it's an open and permissionless market. And what the proposers basically have to do is just pick the highest bid from the builders, sign it, and that's their job done. So it's extremely unsophisticated.
Okay, got it. So
I have one spicy point of trolling to add, which is I think that's all correct. I will say the original prediction was also a 10-year prediction. So I think we've seen certain PhD armies coming, but this is really like the validation to my army of PhD thesis, not like the culmination of it. And so I expect the market will continue to kind of go through many changes. And as a community, we need to kind of think very carefully about what we want our protocols to do, how we want the incentives to be aligned, how we want this distribution to work when there are many competing interests and things like that.
okay, so the idea here is that becoming a Ethereum blockchain proposer, is it the same thing to say validator? Or
So
not,
as a
not
validator,
really?
you have two roles. One is proposing, which you do roughly once every 6 months when you win the proposal lottery. And then there's attesting, which you do every epoch, which is every 6.4 minutes. You basically cast a vote.
Okay, so, but in general terms, to become an Ethereum validator is becoming an increasingly more sophisticated role. And that is what causes increased centralization. Is that right? Because the barrier to entry becomes higher and higher, so there's fewer people who can actually participate in the network effectively, and Phil predicts this will just keep getting worse, or speaking in just like objective terms, more just more specialized. So the idea here to like how to fix this is to split the function of validators between proposer and builder, so that one job is easier to do, so the barrier of entry is lower, and so you can keep the network more decentralized. So that's on the point of like the impact on the centralization front. But now if we can also double click on the other aspect you mentioned that MEV impacts is, which is the incentive alignment. So I don't know, maybe Kushal, if you want to dive into this aspect deeper. So what's at play here? Is it that these arbitrage bots looking to extract value are messing with the incentives that are supposed to go to validators? Is that basically what's happening?
Yeah, so there are various competing interests here. So I think we have to conceptually, if we think about different entities, there are validators, then there are these extra protocol entities like builders, searchers, who are looking to basically maximize their profits and who in some sense do not have a stake in the protocol, who are kind of not directly avoided by the protocol, but they can take strategic actions that may even be short term, like just for this current block, and they don't care where the protocol goes in the long term. Then there are also obviously users who are sending these transactions with some expectations of getting some sort of execution for their transactions. Now, all of them have interests which are sometimes competing to each other. So, for example, users would ideally like to get the best execution that they can get, and would also ideally like to get included as fast as they could with maximum privacy, with maximum security. So those are the interests of the users. Then you also have these extra protocol entities that would do anything that they can to maximize their profits. And you also have to take that into account. Otherwise, they kind of, in some sense, crowd out the space of incentives. They kind of distort the incentives over the players. So you kind of also have to think about them, even if they're not part of the protocol. And the third one is validators. It's a bit unclear to me actually what the incentives for the validators. How should we think about the incentives of the validators? Because there are kind of like various kinds of validators. There are kind of people who are just delegating their stake to operators who are running validators. Then there are large companies who are running very large amounts of money as validators. And then there are, of course, solo stakers that everybody is rooting for. These are people who are running kind of validators on their home machines, and who don't have, in some sense, the sophistication, these armies of PhDs to help them in their duties as a validator. So there are various kinds of entities here, and various competing incentives, and it's actually very, very interesting to even from a research perspective, as to how do we kind of create a protocol that works usually well for all of these entities. That's the answer to your direct question, Camilla. But I would also like to add a little bit to the previous question that we were discussing about PBS and sophisticated validators and so on. We have to be a little bit careful here in kind of figuring out how MEV impacts centralization. Usually, the barrier to entry as to participate as a validator is quite low. You just download the default software and you run it, and you can become a validator. So in that sense, it's not imposing any extra barrier to entry. The only difference there is basically if you do the default behavior of downloading the default software, you don't have an army of team PhDs to help you, then maybe the value that you get out of the protocol might be a little bit lower or more, depending on the market conditions and stuff like that. But it might be lower than entities who have a lot of resources to do their validator duty. So in some sense, there's a spectrum here. You can do the default behavior or you can do a sophisticated behavior. But in my opinion, the barrier to entry is not that high. It's only the incentives that differ on a spectrum. And it's we have to think about economic incentives. We also have to think about other incentives of large companies who maybe also, care about their credibility, their social reputation, and things like that. But I'd stop here. I have many more things to say here, but I'd let Phil and Justin also chip in.
I mean, one thing I'll say is that from the perspective of the L1, the potential benefits of MEV is monetary. So just like EIP 1559 harnesses congestion to lead to an ETH burn, which benefits all ETH holders, and ultimately increases the price of ETH, which increases economic security and economic bandwidth that can be used as collateral on DeFi and within Ethereum more generally. The exact same dynamic could be happening if we had MEV burn. So we could take the value that Ethereum generates, capture it in the form of a burn, redistribute it to ETH holders, and that has positive second-order effects from a monetary standpoint. It increases the scarcity of ETH, and it makes it more likely for it to become money. And one of my theses is that you can't be the internet of value if you are not internet money. And so these two things come hand in hand, and the success of Ethereum is closely tied to the success of Ether, the asset.
Super interesting. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I was just gonna maybe add one more point. I think everything said so far very interesting and valid. I think when you're talking about centralization forces, there's a number that are super interesting. So there's barrier to entry. There's like general curves of kind of incentives, as we've talked about. There's also subsidies to certain attacks that say larger actors can perform on smaller ones. There's infrastructure centralization. We've seen concerns around stake tokens having kind of shared centralized infrastructure or block builders or other protocol components. There's centralization along latency or certain arbitrage advantages or exclusive order flow. So many of these forces kind of have the net effect of concentrating power in the system rather than distributing it. I think these are the two opposing modes. So I think we should be very thorough about everything we do and like, what are all the possible centralization vectors and do they or don't they apply, and are we sure?
Right. There's not just one aspect to think about, but so many different ones that are at play here. But how to put things in perspective, like how big is this issue? How can MEV be quantified? Like what was MEV this past month or this past year, or whatever time period makes the most sense to measure it in.
So on Ethereum L1, the answer is 800 ETH per day. And if you go to mevboost.pix, you will see this graph which shows the total amount of ETH since the merge. And it's a straight line, which means that on average, but also with very low volatility, it's 800 ETH per day. And if you want a bit of a comparison relative to congestion fees, which are base fees on Ethereum, it's about 4 times less. So in other words, 20% is MEV, also known as contention fees, and 80% is base fees, also known as congestion fees. And so in the grand scheme of things, MEV is a small source of income for a chain. And one of the things that I think will happen is that as applications become more and more sophisticated and we have more and more infrastructure like encrypted mempools, this ratio is going to lean more and more in favor of congestion. And my particular thesis is that we're going to have 99% congestion fees and 1% MEV in relatively short order.
Oh, interesting. So this is becoming less of an issue overall.
According to some people, certainly. So Justin and I have gone back and forth on this a lot. I don't think we need to waste everyone's time on this podcast, but it's called DYOR. So I encourage you to form your own model, do your own research, gather your own data. Personally, I don't think there's actually this split between congestion and contention. Like I think a lot of congestion fees are fueled by contention in the same way congestion pricing is fundamentally kind of capturing the value of people's contention to use a resource. Congestion and contention kind of go hand in hand. So trying to parcel them out, you're kind of just moving value from one box to another, but it's still extractable in various games. So that's my 2-second counter argument. But, I think it's unknown. It's like one of those problems, like so many in MEV, where the jury is still out, and it's very early actually in knowing how these systems even work. It is certainly possible, like MEV will go to 0 for some definition of MEV. Although you have to, like we said with Kushal earlier, be very careful exactly what definition you're using.
But in broad terms, do you agree that that MEV in at least like the definition that Justin is referring to will decrease from 20% to 1%?
It's very hard to say because again, that MEV boost.pix is not really what I would consider. It's a measure of like value that is extracted by PBS, which is very different than MEV available on ETH because it only considers like actual extraction through one API. It ignores side deals. It ignores things like centralized systems like UniX that basically centralize a portion of MEV that I consider very much still MEV. So there are a lot of things being shoved out of the box. I think it really depends on how you draw the box. I don't expect the actual number of things in the world to decrease personally.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So in general, you believe that the MEV will continue being this in the same kind of magnitude going forward, unless some of these fixes are implemented.
Well, I think the things that would change MEV are protocol changes or market structure changes on the MEV stack, changes in user behavior, changes in dApp design to, let's say, internalize or claim more of the MEV for themselves. So that won't decrease the total amount of MEV, but it will decrease this number, which is how much is being extracted for L1 over PBS or how much is being reflected in the congestion fees of L1. A lot of that stuff may happen in other domains, or it may not. It's unclear. So I expect the total amount of MEV as I define it will not go down. It's possible that the amount of MEV on PBS specifically may go up or down. I think it's still very early to tell from my perspective.
And to clarify, this 800 ETH per day, is that coming out of, like the slippage of trades for end Ethereum users? Like, I don't know, is that kind of the end impact on Ethereum users?
Yeah, so roughly speaking, there's 2 big buckets of MEV that's extracted through MEV Boost specifically. One is sandwiching, which, as you said, is like exploiting the slippage tolerance. And two is what's known as sex-dex arbitrage, the arbitrage between centralized and decentralized exchanges. And roughly speaking, is like 50-50. And if you want to get a sense of how much MEV there is per block, very roughly speaking, there's 800 blocks per day, actually a little less, 7,200. And there's 800 ETH per day, so there's about 0.1 ETH per block of MEV.
Okay, and then in this proposed solution of like the proposer builder separation, that would deter or limit arbitrators' capacity of taking that kind of cut of trades? Is that how it works?
So the MEV is a pipeline. It starts with the user, it ends with the proposer, but in between there's all sorts of actors. There's the wallet, the searcher, the builder, the relay. And towards the end of the pipeline, they are the receiving end of MEV. And so they want to maximize how much MEV they receive. And so, for example, the proposer will connect to very sophisticated builders that themselves connect to very sophisticated searchers that can extract as much MEV. But on the starting end of the pipeline, on the user and wallet side of things, they want to minimize the amount of MEV that gets lost. And so one you can think of it as a, anyway. And so on the user and wallet side of things, and on the dApp side of things, there is an opportunity to build infrastructure. Like one of the prime pieces of infrastructure that Phil actually alluded to is this notion of an encrypted mempool. So today you have centralized encrypted mempools that are operated by centralized entities like Uniswap X or Flashbot Protect, or even MetaMask now has a centralized encrypted mempool. And that provides like some amount of protection to users, but it's not the best deal that they can necessarily have, and it's also very centralizing. For sex-dex arbitrage specifically, there's projects like Sorella, for example, that are looking to have new DEX designs where the arbitrage opportunity is auctioned off to the broader market, and the proceeds of the auction are returned to the liquidity providers. So in the context of a decentralized exchange, the users, or at least some of the users, are the liquidity providers. And they're not getting the best deal that they could be getting today. And the idea of Sorella is to try and rebate some of that value back to the liquidity providers. And basically my thesis is that at least on a per transaction basis, the amount of MEV will go down dramatically. There will be less leakage from the users to the proposers. But what we're going to see is the number of users is going to grow, 4 orders of magnitude from 10 million users, let's say, to 10 billion users. And so on a aggregated basis, we might go above and beyond the 800 ETH per day.
Okay. So on the dApp front, there's all this effort to mitigate the effects of MEV, but then PBS would be on more of the like protocol design front. And is there are there other efforts on in this direction, or is this kind of the main one that you think will have an impact?
So sometimes there's a confusion around PBS. So it turns out that proposer-builder separation is a very abstract term that is about a whole class of designs. And two specific instances of PBS are, one is MEV Boost, which we have in production today. You can think of it as being off-chain proposer-builder separation. And then there's another one, which is known as ePBS, or Enshrined Proposer Builder Separation, which is trying to mitigate some of the downsides of MEV Boost, namely around the fact that there are relays that have to be trusted, mutually trusted by the proposers and the builders. My personal thesis is that we're actually not going to see Enshrined PBS happen on Ethereum. And the reason is that now we have even better designs. We have this notion called execution tickets, and there's something even better than execution tickets known as execution auctions. So the research keeps on surprising us. There's always better designs out there. And you can think of execution tickets and execution auctions as being an even stronger version of proposer-builder separation. You can kind of think of it as being attester-proposer separation. So you remember how I said that as a validator, you basically have two roles. You have the proposing, which happens roughly once every 6 months in a kind of lottery, and then you have the attesting. The attesting is extremely simple. You either vote whether or not the parent block arrived on time or it did not arrive on time. You just have one bit of entropy. There's not much you can do. You can be very unsophisticated. All the sophistication comes in with the proposing. And so what attester-proposer separation is saying is that as a validator, you don't have to be a proposer. Like that is completely shunted to the market. And so any risks of centralization have been pushed away from the validator set.
Super interesting. We have a couple of questions. So from our listeners, evmtools.xyz is asking, how much MEV has shifted to layer 2s since the blob release? And does 800 ETH include MEVs for L2s? And very quickly, somebody asked, DeFi DGen asked before, what was the website that I think Phil mentioned to track the value extracted?
Justin mentioned it, but it's mevboost.pix.
Mevboost.pix. Okay. Okay, but now to the L2 question. Whoever wants to get that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll take a stab. I'll include L2s along with Alt L1. So it's not included necessarily directly in that number, although there could be second order effects. For example, there's certain L2 transaction types that do pay for gas on L1. So as before, it's hard to completely separate it unless you really have a notion as to why. But certainly there's L2 transactions that are not included in this flow. For example, if you do an atomic arb on an L2 or a sexdex that kind of purely stays on an L2, it wouldn't have any reason to be reflected in this number. So I think the numbers in general for like all chains, for all domains that actually look at these protocol comparisons are fairly immature. There are certainly dashboards, there are certainly heuristics and numbers you could look at, but I wouldn't say scientifically we have like a great notion. In my experience, actually many of these L2s and other domains may even have more MEV if you look at the same methodology as on L1. Because remember here, we're not looking at MEV as is defined in Clockwork Finance. We're looking at what is extracted via MEV Boost, which is a different quantity. Those other domains, those L2s, those other L1s, they may not have an efficient MEV option. They may have a lot of waste in this process that actually allows like a lot more to be extracted for the same or lower amount of financial activity. So I think this is a big call to the community to DYOR on all of these protocol designs and how they affect MEV.
One of the realities of L2s today is that they have centralized sequences. And one of the benefits that these centralized sequences provide is MEV protection for the users. So if you look on Base or Arbitrum or OP mainnet, there is no sandwiching. And the reason is that the centralized sequencer is effectively operating a centralized encrypted mempool. As a user, I send my transaction end-to-end encrypted to the centralized sequencer that never goes to the public. There's no notion of a public mempool. And so they promise, based on reputation, that they will include the transactions as they come in and they will not front run and back run, which is what's required for sandwiching. And so in some sense, the MEV on L2s is zero. Well, specifically the extracted part of the MEV. But as Phil was saying, the extractable part, we don't really know because the MEV pipeline hasn't been matured. In order for true like market-based dynamics to come in, we need to have decentralized sequencing. And when we move to decentralized sequencing, we no longer have trust and reputation in the centralized operator. We're just opening it up to the market. And in that context, we should be expecting things like MEV Boost and PBS to emerge. But one of the things that these L2s don't want is for the move to decentralized sequencing to be negative for the user experience of their users. They don't want their users to suddenly be sandwiched. And so my personal belief is that we need encrypted mempools to be much more mature before we can have decentralized sequencers. And so that part of MEV, which today exists but is not extracted, will be essentially eliminated once we do have these encrypted mempools.
Super interesting. Is there any suspicion? Maybe I don't know if it's the right word, but like any, yeah. Does anyone think that L2s or those controlling L2 sequencers are extracting value somehow, reordering transactions or sandwiching people? Is there like any sort of?
I wouldn't speculate today. I will say, so I think that's broadly true if you look at the value the sequencers are extracting, but it's worth noting there are ways to sandwich people even under honest sequencers, even under threshold mempools. You can, for example, spam blind bots that do sandwiching logic on chain. You can also use latency kind of optimization depending on the position. You could have these providers also selling colocation, for example. That would be very hard to detect or police. I don't want to accuse anyone, and I think everyone in the space actually does have good intentions, and their incentives right now are to make their early stage projects successful. So I doubt from the sequencer side we're seeing malicious behavior. I'm sure we're seeing many people testing the limits of what you can do, even if the sequencer is gating you, though. And in some of these alt L1s in the past, we've also seen centralized sequencers kind of suffer a number of either DOS attacks or peering attacks or kind of espionage style attacks on transactions to extract their MEV. So sometimes even if the sequencer doesn't extract it, it's leaving it on the table for someone else to play a game.
Interesting. Okay, and then also, I wanted to highlight that point on encrypted mempools and how, Justin, you were saying they need to be. Is it more robust, or there's kind of still development to be done on encrypted mempools for them to be workable, or what's kind of the why can't they just be implemented today?
So there's many different ways to implement an encrypted mempool that are based on different types of cryptography. The simplest type of cryptography is HTTPS, just end-to-end normal plain encryption. And this is something that could be done, but basically what we need is all the wallets to send to centralized encrypted mempools like Flashbot Protect, which is doable, but it's kind of a coordination game. Right now, there's a well-defined RPC endpoint where all the wallets send their flow to. It's very centralized, very clear. But one of the downsides of having the wallets choose a centralized encrypted mempool, let's say Flashbot Protect, is that could lead to these centralized operators gaining a huge amount of undue power in the system. And so ideally, we're in a position where the encrypted mempool is public and permissionless. And there's basically three types of technologies that promise to give us that. Number one is what Phil's working on with Flashbots called Suave. And the idea is to use hardware enclaves, TEEs, things like SGX or TDX. And the idea here is that as a user, I send my transaction to a trusted enclave. And from the perspective of an observer, I can't see the contents of the transactions that are in the enclave, but the enclave itself can manipulate the transaction. So they can build bundles and blocks and propose those to the proposers. Then we have something slightly more fancy called threshold encryption. This is something that Arbitrum is building. The idea is that the Arbitrum governance would select a committee or federation of entities that they kind of trust, at least on a threshold basis. So they say, at most 1/3 of this committee will ever be corrupted. And then they use threshold encryption to run the mempool. And then there's the most fancy form of encryption called delay encryption, which is the most trustless because you're not trusting a hardware manufacturer like Intel. You're not trusting a committee or federation. You're just trusting pure cryptography in some sense. But that is the most fancy version and maybe the most far out. Actually, there is a fourth version called witness encryption, which is complete moon math that's possibly decades in the future. But yeah, I don't want to go into the details.
Okay. And then Phil and Kushal, I'm interested in your opinion on whether the this the so Justin mentioned there was the off-chain way of adding PBS or the enshrined way, and Justin said he doesn't think there will be a enshrined PBS. What do you guys think?
Maybe I can take a stab at it. I think enshrined PBS in general is first of all, we have to realize it's a very big change to the consensus protocol itself, or to the core protocol itself. So even to start with, I think we have to be skeptic of any big change to the protocol actually being live, because it's the merge itself was so hard, and making these big protocol changes is not a small task. I think we also have to think about whether what are the other alternates to PBS as well, right? PBS is one design which kind of tries to mitigate some effects of MEV. But as we were talking about encrypted mempools, we were talking about some form of decentralized sequencing. We have to also think about whether those kind of protocol changes would get us more mileage than just enshrining PBS. But I would say that to me, at least, yeah, I would agree with Justin. It looks quite implausible as of now, at least in the short term, that we would have PBS in the core protocol of Ethereum.
Yeah, maybe I'll end it by confusing everyone, because I thought those were both great, valid, clear answers. But like, my question is, enshrine what? Like, I think if the ETH protocol does nothing from now, you've kind of enshrined the eventual iteration of MEV Boost. I think a lot of the proposals, APS, execution tickets, execution auctions, there's many more EPBS, PTC, I forget all the acronyms. They're like all some form of speaking to some sort of role distinction. The role distinction right now already exists. There are parties that are kind of building, and there are parties that are validating or proposing. Do we want those to be one? Do we want them to remain separate? I think we'll determine what changes we want to enshrine. I don't expect the ETH protocol will enshrine nothing. I think it will have to make like kind of activist choices on market structure. I also don't expect any proposal that's out there today to be enshrined. It's like still very early from a research point of view. We've just talked about the best proposals being auctions, but building an auction is very hard. Auction theory is hard. There's still a ton of work to do in even the research camp. So yeah, I mean, I expect something will be enshrined, and it will be some form of mimetic PBS. But I think DYOR on like what that actually should be, I think it's on every DApp and every protocol to actually think about this. It's a question you asked earlier of like, why does it matter for the DApp? Because this is your MEV pipeline and it kind of ends there. So it will affect the power dynamics of the rest of the kind of transaction flow, which is at the end of the day, the most important thing, I think, for your users. Huge call to DYOR on future PBS proposals and make your voices heard.
Okay, so I guess like a takeaway here is that we're still early in at least in this aspect of researching MEV and what type of fix it needs to be implemented either at the chain level or off chain, and there's just like many different alternatives that I guess are still in the early phases of research. Like my question is, are any of these close to being like crossing a finish line, like actually being implemented, or like where in the research phase are we with these fixes?
So one that I would like to highlight is this recent work that we put out at IC3. which talks about how you can have PBS, but you can also combine it with other mechanisms that would be beneficial for users. So in some sense, you are able to kind of have a combination of a mechanism which kind of extracts the maximum value so that incentives of, say, builders, searchers, validators are kind of aligned. But you kind of combine it with a mechanism that, like an encrypted mempool, centralized encrypted mempool, for example, that protects the incentives for users. And so you combine this mechanism, and you can actually, turns out, do it in a way which is very minimal change to the current MEV boost infrastructure. In some sense, it's kind of like, I think of it as like version 1.0 or 0.1 of the eventual SWAV architecture, where you kind of have the sophisticated off-chain entities that are kind of trying to build a block somehow, kind of catering to the incentives of all the entities. But you can actually do a much simpler version of it today, and which is very close to production. You can take the help of the existing MEV boost architecture to actually, in some sense, cater to the incentives of users as well in this MEV supply chain.
Got it. We have another question from evmtools.xyz. How do you think cross-chain intents would impact, if any, MEV? Who wants to take?
If no one else wants it, I'll go.
Go for it.
All right. Yeah, it's hard to say. I think cross-chain intents can be so broad. It depends on the details. Like cross-chain intents could be a form of MEV. Like you may have some value attached to executing a certain cross-chain set of actions, and like that's your intention. Then that very directly creates MEV. And it very directly creates MEV in both of the domains also. We have a paper on this. There's a number of also projects trying to build various mechanisms around that, some of which are more synchronous, some of which are kind of more economic in nature, including SWAV as one of them. It really depends how your cross-chain system works, how your cross-chain intent is kind of framed, and how your MEV is designed. It's my belief in general, more chains increases MEV because the boundary of the domains is like a relevant point for coordination and value exchange. And there are more and more of those as you add systems in each one of the systems. It's like, it's kind of like a polynomial relationship there. So that's at least my own personal opinion.
Yeah, makes sense. If you're adding more layers to the interaction of transacting on chain, there will be more opportunities of arbitrage, and that inherently should increase MEV, right?
But the word intent is usually bundled, or sometimes bundled with OFAs, which are basically auctions where so-called solvers or searchers compete to provide the best deal for the user. So the user submits their intent to this auction, and then you have searcher 1, 2, and 3 who are all competing to satisfy the intent and return as much value as possible to the user. And so if we have a very sophisticated market of searchers and solvers, which I'm hopeful we will eventually, thanks to marketplaces like Suave, which are meant to be like maximally permissionless, so any solver can come in, then users might actually have a great deal. So even though like technically the MEV is very large, the extractable portion is very large, most of it is extracted and returned or rebated back to the user.
Okay, right. So by increasing competition of finding the best path for the user, maybe the actual extracted value is reduced.
Yeah, and as Justin said, it could be reduced by going back to the user. I think that's a great point. And there's many ways to use the formula. You can harness it and build a mechanism around it that's competitive, and then the value goes to the user. Or you can send it all to the validator, or you can burn like 150% of it to the point where there's a tax on transactions even. Like there's all sorts of constructions you can make. I am hopeful in the same vision as Justin, basically, that eventually whatever mechanism users use, we can call it an OFA, I think, today, but I think of it as a group or a union in some ways of user orders in kind of a single system, maybe a subsystem of ETH-L1 itself. Those should give users very good deals through MEV, and it should actually be a positive user experience for the chain.
I'd love to, in line with that, spend a bit more time talking about the idea that Justin mentioned earlier of moving MEV towards ETH Bern and how that would work, and how close we potentially are of seeing that. I think, as probably for ETH holders, that would be the best outcome, and I'm sure people will be really interested to hear that that's a real possibility, that MEV can actually go towards ETH Burn.
So in my opinion, the ideal outcome is that the vast majority of the MEV is rebated back to the users. But there will almost certainly be some amount of MEV which is fundamental or extremely difficult to rebate back to the users. Phil was talking about like the statistical sandwiching or whatever it is. Like there's like very advanced kind of long tail stuff where the MEV won't go to exactly zero. It will still be there. And I think the best thing that we could do is take this unrebatable MEV and spread it to as many parties as possible. And in the case of Ethereum, that's ETH holders. What's happening today is that the MEV is going to stakers. And there's kind of two issues with that. Issue number one is that the stakers are a subset of the wider ETH holders. So you're not distributing to the largest possible extent. But maybe the biggest issue is that the MEV is distributed in an extremely spiky way. So there's some blocks which have almost no MEV, and then there's some blocks which have hundreds of ETH of MEV. I think the record block is 673 or 72 ETH. So you kind of win the jackpot. And the problem with this spikiness, with this volatility, is that it's an incentive, for example, for pooling. And so there's all sorts of services out there that offer pooling, and in some sense it's not very friendly to the sort of validators. There's this because of the nature of the spikiness, it turns out that the average amount of MEV is significantly greater than the median amount of MEV. So what that means is that if you're like running a solar validator, then more likely than not you're going to have an APY which is smaller than the average. So the vast majority of solar validators that don't opt into pooling are kind of getting a bad deal. And so there's this incentive to join pooling. And so the nice thing about distributing the MEV to all the ETH holders through the burn is that you remove the spikiness as well.
Super interesting. Phil, Kushal, any other additional points on adding MEV to ETH Burn?
I have thoughts, but do you want to go first, Kushal?
Yeah, I think I would kind of agree that the kind of spikiness of MEV is one of the big problems. And in some sense, you could kind of distribute it through various ways of burning it. But all these proposals do kind of need to take into account whether we are kind of optimizing for the value of ETH itself, whether we are optimizing it for usability of the chain somehow, where users get the best deal. So there are various ways of distributing it, and ultimately we have to kind of, maybe Ethereum or other layer ones have to kind of make this active choice as to what they're optimizing for. So MEV burn in some sense optimizes for distributing it to all the wide ETH ecosystem, but maybe you only burn the amount that's kind of not rebatable to the users. And as Justin mentioned, you could kind of try to first maximize the rebate and then burn the rest.
Yeah, I think I echo a lot of what's being said. I want to make maybe two slightly different but interesting points. One is on the spikiness of MEV. Like, I think there is also a lot more research that needs to be done here because what we're talking about is basically internalizing more of these spikes into some box that we're creating in the protocol. And I think that's valid and important for the reasons we said, like smoothing, increasing kind of returns for smaller validators and things like that. On the other hand, it also kind of provides an incentive to go outside the system in a way, because MEV is inherently spiky. There's some physical aspect to that, like when there is a new strategy discovered, when there is new alpha that only one person has, when there is an exploit that one person finds before another. These are all like kind of instances on the ETH blockchain that inherently create huge MEV spikes. So the question is like, how far can we go? Because to the extreme, if say everything is distributed, then maybe we have pools where the person who has the exploit can off-chain negotiate with this pool in some way to take this value outside of the mechanism. Have we totally prevented that? Do we actually have a good market? I think these are all the interesting kind of MEV collusion questions that come up in MEV smoothing. I'm very bullish the direction, but I think there's probably a lot of work that needs to happen. Lastly, to the point about kind of distribution and the holders versus not, I always like to say that one is above my pay grade, because it's in some ways kind of a political question. Like if you ask the holders, they'll say like, of course, like it should go to the token. And then you say, the validators come in and say, but we're paying for all this chain security. We're the ones like here getting slashed sometimes. Shouldn't we get like a little bit of this lottery winning once in a while? And the users say, but my transaction created the value, shouldn't it go back to me as like the actual owner of the information that created the value? And the dApps say, well, we represent our users as a whole. Shouldn't we distribute it among all our users that are together creating this value through the system? I don't think there's actually a right answer in this. My trolling is, it's like the MTA or a public transit system where you're essentially compromising among many parties. And to me, a good outcome, and maybe my job to like push the outcome in the direction, is one where everyone's kind of like a little bit unhappy with it, because if anyone is too happy, it's probably not fair to everyone else. I would maybe troll and contend that we're kind of in that situation today. Fully opening myself to this. But there's like one fun troll.
Yeah, one addition to the set of things that Phil pointed out was also builders and people who are actually extracting this, and maybe would also say, we are the ones who are extracting all this value. Shouldn't we get some of this? And dominantly, that's what's happening right now, which is they are the ones who are getting all that value.
I forgot about that, since our builder doesn't currently charge a fee. So.
And there's also other secondary effects. So for example, if you burn the MEV, there's less total value that can go to the stakers. And so we should expect the validator set to go down. And there's reasons for that to happen. For example, making sure that we don't overpay for security. We have a huge amount of economic security. Maybe it'd be best for the validator set to not be as large.
So not a simple answer for sure. Like so many different parties and interests to keep incentivized and aligned and keep happy for Ethereum to continue chugging along and hopefully become the value layer of the internet. And as we wrap up, I want to take a look at MEV from kind of like a broader point of view, and speaking of becoming the value layer of the internet. Like if we think about it from a more, if you want to call it like values or like philosophical point of view, the reason why MEV is an issue or should be better handled. I think if Ethereum is to become the settlement layer for finance, like some people argue it should, or the value layer for the internet, or whatever kind of big vision you have for Ethereum, how does MEV limit that potential? Like, why is it important that this is dealt with? I mean, to me, the big issue here is MEV in one way or another makes transacting in Ethereum unfair. Like, it seems like somebody's coming in between me and the chain transactions, where my expectation is that, I'm interacting with a smart contract and I'm getting, like a fair outcome. But if somehow there's like this bot that is giving me a worse deal than I should get, then it's not an objective value layer anymore. Like it's there's something off there. There's like an unfair situation, which might prevent Ethereum from becoming this like big like world computer that it's meant to be. So I'd love your take on kind of the big issue here, like what's like beyond like the 800 ETH, just like beyond the numbers, like in like a philosophical standpoint, like a value standpoint, like why does MEV matter?
I guess there's two perspectives you can take. One is at the L1. From the perspective of the L1, we want to be as secure as possible, and things like decentralization really matter. And again, MEV can change the incentives and this distort the decentralization that we're trying to put at L1. At L2, I would think of MEV as being friction for the users, very similar to transaction fees and scaling. Right, the whole point of scaling is to try and reduce transaction fees per transaction, and I think encrypted mempools and whatnot is a similar thing, just in a different way. It just reduces friction, and that will lead to ultimately more efficient markets, better pricing, better execution, all of these things. And in that sense, trying to address MEV with better applications is a lubricant that can make the incentive value grow to its ultimate potential much faster.
Yeah, I think we kept the most interesting point for the last. So I'm very excited that you brought up this point. I think we have to think about it from maybe two broad aspects. One is the user experience in the short term or in the day-to-day term. So what kind of deals users are getting, what is their perception of fairness, and things like that. The second one would be resilience of the system to any long-term vulnerability. So that could be coming from centralization, that could be coming from, I would argue, even from legal perspective or regulations. But we have to think about it from multiple angles, and we have to optimize for both day-to-day aspects as well as resilience in the long term. In general, I would say a good rule of thumb is to kind of have not too many entities come in between the users and the core protocol. By core protocol, I mean the kind of default software, for example, what Ethereum Foundation releases, or the spec that we have for the protocol. But if you have more and more actors come in between, users get further and further apart from the core protocol that we are trying to optimize for the resilience of. I think a good rule of thumb is let's try to keep the number of middlemen as low as possible.
Phil, closing words.
I love the middle. I've been calling it middle people rule. I think it's a great heuristic. Maybe I'll troll a little bit. Like, I think everything that's been said about avoiding the downsides of MEV is true. I also think MEV is a great opportunity. Like, if you look at the auctions that we're running in crypto today, the settlement lifecycle of a transaction, and you compare it to something like Robinhood OFA on Citadel, I mean, it's almost embarrassing how the world settles most of its transactions. We've built already something that's far more competitive, especially for the market size, more decentralized with a lower barrier to entry, and more able to be scaled to like much larger numbers of participants and much greater value, and also many more geographies than kind of the 70s era technology of having a server in a data center in New Jersey allows. So I don't think it's all doom and gloom. I think MEV is actually our opportunity as a community to build things that work for users, to build things that are also secure on the infrastructure level and explore that push and pull, but without kind of reverting to all of the models that we already know are actually very unfair. Like, it's very hard to get a seat at a lot of these exchanges that people trade equities on. That's not through some broker or through some set of intermediaries. The middle person heuristic is very bad in TradFi. So how do we keep being better than that? How do we make sure that the kind of dominant forces that be in the system, including things like capital concentration and sophistication and armies of PhDs, mean our system gets like more and more decentralized, and we can use all these things that both Justin and Kushal are working on. So threshold mempools, all these encryption technologies, new forms of user transaction flow that go into the building time and kind of play the MEV game. I think these are all like very, very, very exciting opportunities to embarrass TradFi and kind of establish the value case for crypto as a trading platform.
Love that take. And the perfect place to end the live stream. Very optimistic view of crypto and what we have so far. Definitely agree. Magnitude many times better than TradFi. And I would much rather have MEV being extracted by free market bots than a centralized system where it's all gate kept and just a few people can decide what happens under the hood of an exchange. So we're already better than TradFi, but we just need to keep making a more fair layer one, basically.
On crypto, GameStop never stops trading. Remember that.
Exactly. Yes. Awesome. Okay, we'll end it here. Thanks, everyone. Thanks so much to the panelists and everyone who joined us. And remember to tune into the next DYOR. Bye.
Thank you.